Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This week we are taking a trip into the world of crime and mystery fiction as we celebrate the upcoming release of our brand new anthology, Guilty Secrets, which we created in collaboration with the Crime Writers Association. We've worked with the CWA, as they're also known, on several anthologies over the years, including Midsummer Mysteries and Then There Were More, and we're really pleased to be partnering with them again. Guilty Secrets features 23 original stories from crime writers across the globe, and it officially launches next Tuesday, so today's episode actually gives you an early taste of what to expect. The story we have chosen from the collection for today's episode is called The Follies by Martine Bailey. It's set in the aftermath of the First World War, and it begins at this hospital for soldiers suffering from shell shock. And this doctor finds himself drawn into a case that proves much more strange than he first expects, which is always a good start to a story. I really like the setting in this one. It definitely has a touch of Gothic atmosphere, and we love that at Flame Tree. There are woods and tunnels, obviously follies and hidden corners, and it all makes it this perfect place for a mystery to unfold. Martine Bailey has recorded a short introduction to tell us a little bit more about the story in her own writing, so let's hear from her now.
Hello, my name's Martine Bailey. I'm a novelist and the author of 4 historical mysteries. My first novel, An Appetite for Violets, was inspired by the 18th century Gothic tradition. It follows a young cook who travels to Italy with her mistress, only to discover she's become entangled in a murderous conspiracy. More recently, I drew on my experiences working in the NHS, where I used to administer personality tests. A chief nurse once asked me a question around the time that a nurse had been convicted of harming children. Could a personality test catch a killer? The idea became my crime novel, Sharp Scratch, about a young personnel officer who tries to use psychometric testing to uncover a murderer inside her hospital. My new short story, The Follies, brings together both of those interests, the Gothic past and the psychology of the human mind. It was inspired by a real place, the Hawkstone Follies in Shropshire. It's a very strange and haunting landscape of sandstone hills scattered with caves, funerary monuments, bridges spanning high ravines and a maze of grottos, an 18th century pleasure ground designed to astonish and also unsettle its visitors. I've located my story just after the First World War, when many country houses were converted into rehabilitation hospitals for wounded soldiers. The Follies is framed as a psychiatric case history, recounted by wise and sage-like psychiatrist Professor Fryer on the final night of a symposium of neurology held at the old country house situated beside the Follies. World War I has ended, but its survivors are still deeply haunted by what they've witnessed. Sitting around a roaring fire, the professor tells his colleagues about his most unusual patient, Lieutenant James Watmore, a soldier physically and mentally damaged by a poison gas attack. But Watmore insists on something stranger still, that he is a fraud, a malingerer, and then he begins to report sightings of a mysterious watcher in the woods, a soldier standing amongst the trees wearing a hideous gas mask, with round glass eyes and a beak-like breathing tube, an apparition that clearly terrifies him. As the professor recalls his patient's history, the story moves into darker territory, involving trauma, doubles, and ultimately a murder investigation. In writing this story, I drew on my long-standing fascination with psychology and abnormal mental states. While researching Sharp Scratch, I read clinical case studies involving shared delusions like folie à deux, the so-called shared madness of two people, and haunters, people who claim to be haunted by apparitions. I also revisited Sigmund Freud's famous essay on the uncanny, where he argues that some of our deepest fears emerge when something familiar becomes suddenly strange, particularly the terrifying idea of encountering one's own double, which in folklore is often a portent of death. And as I wrote the story, it began to feel painfully contemporary, thinking about the Ukraine war and the United States invasion of Iran. I was asking myself why, when it's against all moral reason and basic humanity, do we continue to repeat these cycles of violence? Out of those overlapping ideas, the Gothic landscape, shell shock, psychiatry and war, the Follies emerged. I hope you enjoy the story and perhaps find some ideas to reflect upon once the story has ended.
And now here is The Follies by Martine Bailey, read by Nathan Jadelier.
The Follies by Martine Bailey. Dr. Fryer, would you care to add to our discussion on the most troubling effects of shell shock? Did you have any unusual cases? The elderly psychiatrist gazed into the fire, its light casting wavering shadows across the shabby drawing room. Indeed I did, and one case haunts me still. It has forced me to reflect differently on crime itself. Will you enlighten us, sir? Asked the young student, dragging his chair closer. Dr. Fryer drew on his pipe, regarding the circle of clinicians and students gathered for the final evening of the Symposium of Neurology. I shall try. It has taken some years to piece together what happened, drawing on my memories and official records. At last, I believe I understand. He began to speak in his rich baritone voice, drawing the skeins of his tale into a single thread. During the war, the dilapidated building in which we now gather was the Northern Rehabilitation Hospital. I was appointed medical officer to treat that dreadful new affliction, war, neurosis, or shell shock. One of my patients was a second lieutenant named James Watmore. His record showed that he had trained at the Wellington Cadet College, Madras, and sailed home to sign up in 1915. Along with thousands of his comrades, he was invalided home from France in July 1916. On the surface, his case was typical of gas exposure: tremors, lung damage, choking sensations. Yet, he also suffered the waking nightmares in which the shell-shocked are paralyzed by visions only they can see. What set Watmore apart was his conviction that he was a malingerer, unworthy of his uniform or rank. Though his tunic had been ruined in the attack, he would obsessively recite the litany of what he did not deserve: his lieutenant's pips, his commission papers, his silver-topped swagger stick. In our dream therapy sessions, he described an unseen knife slashing through his gas hood and the subsequent agony of choking to death. I suspected some hidden origin for this guilt complex, an origin story I hoped one day to uncover. Fryer paused while a colleague poked the fire back to roaring life. The ring of faces shone in the gloom, motionless and absorbed. Before the war, this estate belonged to the Warrener family. The woods were strictly out of bounds to staff and patients alike, yet my open-air wards faced them, and I observed that Watmore often rested his eyes on that gloomy barrier of trees. Most of my patients spent their days on my open-air ward, enjoying the pastoral quietude that was my chief therapeutic practice, namely fresh air, nature, quiet, and sleep. Only one landmark rose above the woods, the watchtower, a narrow brick shaft capped with an ornate pinnacle like some Florentine sentinel misplaced in northern England. One day, Watmore reported that he had seen a soldier in those woods. The figure wore khaki and a hooded gas mask, and stood watching him through its grotesque twin eyepieces. He swore it was no hallucination, but a dead man returned to haunt him. When I inquired of his nurse, she confirmed that no watcher existed. Friar tamped his pipe and leaned back, exhaling a plume of aromatic smoke. At our next session, Watmore told me the history of Folly Woods. Lord Gilbert Warrener, in the age of Georgian Gothic fancy, had built tunnels and grottos designed to mimic the classical landscape of the dead. Inside an ancient folio he had found reports of a hellfire club, of masked men indulging in deviant acts. He thrust prints in my hand of various figures in carnival masks. The Plague Doctor, Harlequin, and another owl-headed grotesque with round eyepieces, disturbingly like a gas hood. In the foreground, half-naked captives paraded in submission. My patient's mania had merged old engravings with his battlefield terrors. In my clinical notes, I concluded that his haunting was attached to infantile fantasies centered upon these taboo practices. Up to this point, I had observed Watmore's behavior at first hand. Henceforth, my narrative is largely drawn from the criminal trial that followed. Dr. Fryer raised his head of grey hair and found his listeners intent upon his next words. Watmore's crisis occurred some 3 months after his admission here. His nurse was Miss Beekman Brown, a battle-hardened sister nicknamed Beaky for her parrot-like nose. She was an extremely useful nurse, certainly the best of a poor lot for difficult cases. She had been posted to France and worked ceaselessly right up to the catastrophe of Ypres, when she came to us as our senior sister. On the 17th of October, 1916, she presented Watmore with a summons to attend an official medical board. Apparently, the effect of his reading the letter was to drive him into a fit of helpless terror. His face and body shook in spasms resembling epilepsy. He protested that he would be forced back to the trenches, to the gas and the rats, or maybe worse. He was frantic to escape. If not, he might be arrested, imprisoned, maybe even shot. I had noticed that Sister Beaky's stern aspect hid an affectionate aspect, especially towards her dear Jamie, her favourite on her ward. That night, she promised to smuggle him away to the village tavern until the army doctor had left for good. They met at the open-air ward, muffled in overcoats and scarves, for the golden twilight bore an autumnal chill. She told him that an unfrequented shortcut to the village led through Folly Wood. After ducking under the boundary fence, they approached the first of the follies, a miniature sham castle a mere single wall thick, its windows painted black. Next, they clambered over a tumble of imitation gravestones engraved with words in some unreadable language. Ahead of them, the watchtower loomed ever larger, a spike of mystery against the blushing sky. Arriving at the tower's foot, they paused to take in the giddy height of its brick shaft. A flock of startled birds rose into the dusk, and Watmore called it an omen, like wings clapping in grim applause. The nurse took his arm and spoke reassuringly of the tavern, its shining brasses, cushioned chairs, and famous jugs of ale. At last, they reached the Wishbone Bridge. It wasn't a bridge made of real bones, of course. though in twilight its pale timbers arched like ribs and thigh bones across a deep ravine. Whatmore ventured onto it, the bridge swaying beneath him. The sun had finally set, and the bottom of the ravine was lost in the gathering murk. Manfully he swung onwards. Behind him, Beaky suddenly cried out. She had slipped and twisted her ankle. The bridge swung crazily as she staggered and lurched towards him. The ancient handrail snapped, sending a rope like a whipcord into the night. Crying out, the nurse clutched at his neck as though to drag him down with her. In his panic, he tore her fingers loose of his windpipe and violently flung her aside. She screamed in terror, "Jamie!" Then she toppled off the bridge and was swallowed by the darkness. His listeners stirred uneasily, but Friar continued. Somehow, he groped his way to firm ground and lay down a while. He was now alone in that strange landscape, so reminiscent of the mythical land of the dead. Somehow, he found his way, no doubt with difficulty and not a little fear. He must have believed his prayers were answered when above him he spotted a light, a warm yellow glow in the blackness. He climbed a few stone steps to a lamplit opening in the rock. Above him stared two wide-spaced roundels, like demented eyes fixed upon him. The entrance to the grotto was a wild, distended scream of a mouth that might swallow him into the blackness of its gullet. Dr. Friar leaned back in his chair and sighed. I myself have strayed into that wood, and consider that cave the most repugnant of follies. A replica of the Orcus Cave in the Park of Monsters near Rome. Its original was built by another war-shocked soldier, Francesco Orsini, in the 16th century. All thoughts fly was the motto dedicated to Orcus, the god of the underworld. I wonder now if my patient retained any grip upon his own fleeting thoughts when he stepped over the sharp stone teeth of that cave mouth. A cage-like metal door swung open to his touch. Creeping inside, he saw that the walls were the crimson of butchered meat. On a dais, a lantern burned beside a framed photograph. It was a portrait of Lieutenant James Whatmore. The iron door clanged shut behind him. On the threshold stood a figure in khaki, its linen hood as smooth as an insect's carapace, glass lenses unblinking, rubber beak protruding. The pungent reek of chlorine reached him, seeming to squeeze at his throat. Dr. Friar broke off from the table. Many of you will be familiar with our German colleague, Dr. Freud's thoughts on the particular terror ignited by the uncanny. At the heart of many tales of ghosts and the reanimation of the dead is the terror of meeting one's own double, face to face. At a primitive level, I believe the terror arises from the living man's recognition of his dead double as his enemy, an apparition come to battle with him for his precious life. I believe it is a credit to my patient's courage that he opened his mouth to speak at all. I am sorry for what I did, Whatmore cried. The apparition, more bug-like than humanoid, gave no answer. Instead, it raised a poison gas grenade, its fuse glinting. My patient looked about for a means to escape. In front of him, the metal grill was secured behind the ghastly figure. To his rear, the chamber disappeared in darkness. In terror, he turned and fled into the cave's inner twilight zone, groping his way along the chilly walls. Down into the earth the passage led, until he left the light behind entirely. In time, the passage ran beside a stream. He must have lost his grip, stumbled and fallen, not onto the hard floor, but down into the echoing void of a mine shaft. Friar's voice dropped. The next morning, I sent out a search party as soon as Watmore's bed was found empty. No trace of him in the hospital or grounds. By the afternoon, I called in the police, fearing he might have slept under a hedge and died of exposure. The search party found his corpse 3 days later at the bottom of a well-like pit. He had at first survived the fall. The following day, a post-mortem was performed and the inspector shared his observations with me. My patient had been found deep in a labyrinth of tunnels where an incline ended in a drop of at least 40 feet. His right femur had fractured, undoubtedly causing immense pain. It landed in a circular space 8 feet across, the walls icily smooth and the ground pitted with shallow pools. The inspector observed that it was less a mine shaft, more like the bottom of a well. Damage to his fingers' ends suggested that panic had driven Watmore to scramble at the walls, searching for handholds by which to raise himself. It was estimated that he'd survived for as many as 2 wretched days. The student at Dr. Friar's side whispered, "And Nurse Beekman Brown? Was her body also found?" "No," the doctor said thoughtfully. "On the morning of Watmore's disappearance, Nurse Beekman Brown was at the hospital as usual. She had, however, taken sick leave due to a sprained ankle, purportedly acquired while carrying laundry. Unfortunately, none of us thought to connect the 2 events. Only after Watmore's body was recovered did the police question her. Her quarters were also searched, and an Inspector Gilman called on me to discuss his findings. The inspector discovered that, while in France, she had searched without success for a man with whom she was romantically infatuated, named James Watmore. Then, in May 1916, Watmore's brother Freddie had sent her a devastating letter. Jamie had been found dead in the grounds of a farmhouse near Folkestone, a place that in recent years had been used to house new troops gathered for embarkation to France. It appeared that at the time of his death, Jamie had barely stepped off the boat from India and picked up his gear. A dry well on the farm had recently been cleared, and Jamie's body, beaten but perfectly preserved, lay at its bottom. Still missing, however, were his uniform and kit bag. Freddie had identified the body as his brother's and contacted the War Office about the tragedy. To his intense dismay, Freddie learned that a Lieutenant James Watmore was still drawing his brother's pay, and apparently suffering from shell shock here in the Northern Rehabilitation Hospital. The inspector assured me that my patient was no officer, but a confidence trickster named Tom O'Sullivan, who had shared Watmore's rough billet in a solitary barn on what should have been the pair's final night in England. The following morning, O'Sullivan had vanished and was marked down as a deserter, while a counterfeit Lieutenant Watmore sailed to France, wearing his victim's uniform and showing his credentials. On learning this, Nurse Beekman Brown, who had served a year in the blood-soaked carnage of the forward casualty station, suffered a nervous collapse and was sent home to recuperate. A few weeks later, disobeying her orders to report to a rest home, she gained her post here with us. I studied her full confession during her trial. She gave a full account of her campaign of terror against Tom O'Sullivan. Hidden in her quarters were a uniform, a gas hood, and an empty grenade, alongside a hand-drawn map of Folly Woods and a draft of the forged letter summoning him to a non-existent medical examination. Obsessed with James Watmore, she had masqueraded as the Watcher in the Woods and then lured O'Sullivan from the hospital before staging a fall from the Wishbone Bridge onto a hidden tussock of grass. Swiftly removing her nurse's overcoat to reveal a soldier's uniform, she had only to pull on the gas hood and follow her dear Jamie to the Orcus cave. There, she terrified him into fleeing towards the treacherous mine shaft at its dark, dead end. As I sat in that courtroom, I often wondered about Tom O'Sullivan's final days, waiting for death in a darkness as complete as if he stood hooded before the firing squad. Did he remember the rage of envy he felt against Whatmore? The temptation to steal that commission, to claim those pips on Jamie's khaki leaves for himself? Did he feel again the motion of his limbs rising up from his billet, and the quick smack on Whatmore's head with the swagger stick? And then the cold outdoors, as he hauled the limp body to the well beneath the mantle of night. It seems that when I diagnosed a guilt complex at the center of my patient's illness, it was of a greater scope than I had imagined. Not only had he felt the pressure of guilt from his murder of Jamie Whatmore, he had also been tormented by the most powerful individual in the hospital's small universe, the nurse, who called him Dear Jamie. I believe revenge was Beekman Brown's motive to murder. As for O'Sullivan's motive, it was simply to gain Whatmore's kit. The court heard witnesses to Whatmore's bragging of how he pitied any chap in the lower ranks. The Hunter using gas attacks, he'd been heard to say, but only the officers have the gas hoods that keep the poison out. As to why the hood failed him when the poison gas was released, the answer is mundane. It seems the rats in the trenches had an unfortunate taste for the linen hoods, and many were riddled with holes. A young colleague raised his arm. "Sir, when you spoke of an unusual case of shell shock, were you referring to O'Sullivan or Beekman Brown?" "Well, both did suffer from war neurosis, and both refused to acknowledge their trauma. I must confess I did wonder if O'Sullivan finally recognized that his shell shock was indeed genuine. The shakes that he'd struggled to hide from his men had been real enough, and the record showed he had proved to be a brave and popular officer. In an agony of cold and pain, in the darkness of the pit, he must have wished he'd had the courage to attend that bogus exam. If so, he might have uncovered Beekman Brown's deception. Instead, he would sleep forever in that unclimbable hole, deep in that park of human folly, in a grave of his own creation." "Enough speculation," the doctor said, snapping out of his musings. Nurse Beekman Brown was charged with inciting Tom O'Sullivan's murder, proven by clear evidence of malice aforethought. I attended that tragic case and studied the extensive notes from which I pieced together this account. When the court asked for my medical opinion, I convinced them that the nurse's mind had been unbalanced by an obsessional war neurosis, and thus she avoided the hangman's noose and was committed to Rawthorne Asylum, where she will remain for the rest of her life. To return to your question, I believe that while suffering from shell shock, both patient and nurse were bound together in a folie à deux, both haunted by the same dead man. Perhaps by denying the power of the dead, I failed them both. The violence of war, my friends, demands that men butcher each other yet remain unmoved, and expects that our medical workers witness barbaric scenes fit only for an abattoir, yet feel no more than inanimate stone. Our minds, I'm afraid, are the most sensitive of our organs. I am left wondering who the criminals are here. Tom O'Sullivan, who murdered a man in the vain hope of surviving a gas attack, or Nurse Beekman Brown, who killed him for love's revenge, both of whom were punished most dreadfully. Or perhaps it was a folie de two, and those few who dragged millions into mass insanity are proved the greatest criminals of all.
So by the end of this story, there is a real breakdown in all of the characters' perception of reality. Fryer himself suggests this kind of shared madness where trauma and identity and revenge, they all feed into each other. And he even pushes that idea further because he suggests that the war itself might have created a wider collective instability. And we are left with this feeling of uncertainty over everything. I think this is one where you read it and you want to read it again because you get a new sort of lens and perspective. And I think that's such a great way to tell a story where the more that you read it, the more unravels. So yeah, if you want to re-listen, please do. Let's move on to our second story. We are turning to one of the great names in classic horror fiction, Ambrose Bierce. We featured Bierce on the podcast before, and he was an American journalist, satirist, and short story writer. And it seems kind of pertinent to mention in today's episode, being that it's kind of about mystery, that Bierce's life actually ended in his own mystery. He disappeared without a trace, very sadly, during the Mexican Revolution, and nobody really knows what happened to him. The story we've chosen from his body of work is called The Boarded Window, and we've taken this from our supernatural horror anthology, which we have in our Gothic fantasy series. This story, like The Follies, explores fragile perception and how our experience and fear in life can reshape what people think they've seen. So, starting with a question, why would somebody permanently board up a perfectly good window? Here is The Boarded Window, read by Richard McIver.
The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce. In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence, than, impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed farther westward, to encounter new perils and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs, surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile nor speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door, and, directly opposite, a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not. And none knew why it was so closed, certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep, if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides his years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long full beard were white, his gray, lusterless eyes sunken, his face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden-bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that early day. One day Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told and should remember. I know only that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting, indeed, the circumstance that many years afterward, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost which every well-informed boy thereabout knew haunted the spot. But there is an earlier chapter, that supplied by my grandfather. When Murlock built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman, in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name, of her charms of mind and person tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubt, but God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life, for what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health. But at the end of the third day, she fell into unconsciousness arid, so passed away, apparently, with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like his, we may venture to sketch in some of the details of the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others which he did correctly were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, "I shall have to make the coffin arid, dig the grave, and then I shall miss her, when she is no longer in sight. But now, she is dead, of course. But it is all right. It must be all right, somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem." He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically with soulless care. And still, through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck, that knowledge would come later and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the low, grave chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to a keener life, to another as the blow of a bludgeon, which in crushing benumbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge, and dropped his face into them, tearless yet, and unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the open window a long, wailing sound like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening woods. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream. For Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke, and lifting his head from his arms, intently listened, he knew not why. There, in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see, he knew not what. His senses were all alert. His breath was suspended. His blood had stilled its tide as if to assist the silence. Who, what, had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly, the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step, another, sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified, beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the darkness through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless. His arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him, and at the same instant he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall, with a little groping seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman toward the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there were darkness blacker than before, and silence. And when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high, and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear.
Today's stories both start with something that does not make sense. In The Follies, it's the sight of a mysterious figure watching from the woods. In The Boarded Window, it's a window that has been nailed shut for years. In both cases, there is a perfectly rational explanation waiting underneath, but it takes a while to uncover, and each story ultimately shows how easily fear and guilt can affect the way that we understand what's happening around us. If The Follies caught your attention, don't forget that Guilty Secrets is published next Tuesday. It's packed with plenty more twists and suspicious characters waiting inside. And while we're talking about the CWA, if you are a writer yourself and you like crime, it's well worth taking a look at what they do. They support crime writers at every stage of their careers. If you're more interested in just reading than writing, the Crime Readers Association offers plenty of ways to discover new books, authors, and events from across the genre. So please do take a look. Next week, we'll be staying in the world of crime, but this time our focus shifts towards something slightly more vengeful. After all, revenge is a dish best served cold, I've heard it said.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast and look forward to the next episode. Do recommend it to your friends. Goodbye for now.